Hello, and welcome to Sleep Stories World. I'd like to invite you to step into a world of relaxation and tranquility with this bedtime story, designed to help you unwind and de-stress. Listening to this story will allow you to escape the hustle and bustle of daily life and find solace in a peaceful environment in the comfort of your own space. By engaging in this story, you can embark on a journey that nurtures and soothes your mind, and rejuvenates your body, promoting overall well-being and inner harmony through sound, restful sleep. Allow yourself the opportunity to unwind, recharge, and reconnect with yourself on a profound level. Before we begin, let's prepare your space for rest. I'd like you to aim to sleep somewhere that is comfortably cool, dark, and quiet. If you need to adjust anything in your environment, please do so now. Your curtains, your temperature, your pillows, whatever will help you feel most comfortable. When you're ready, lie down where you will be sleeping. You may want to cover yourself with a light blanket, as your body temperature will decrease slightly as you start to relax. Let yourself settle into your bed, feel the weight of your body being supported. Notice how your mattress rises to meet you. Now, gently close your eyes. There's nothing you need to see anymore tonight. Nothing you need to watch or observe. Your only task now is to be here, in this moment, allowing yourself to receive the gift of rest. Take a deep breath in through your nose, and exhale slowly through your mouth. Take another deep breath, and this time feel your chest expand as the air fills your lungs. Notice the sensation of your ribcage opening. Breathe out, and feel your chest deflate. Feel your body sinking a little deeper into your bed. In. And out. In. And out. With each breath, you're signaling to your body that it's safe to rest, that it's time to let go of the day. Now, empty your mind, and imagine being surrounded by a warm, vibrant light. This light is gentle and comforting, like the soft glow of evening sun filtering through leaves, or candlelight dancing in a peaceful room. This is your light, and it carries with it a deep sense of peace and safety. As you breathe in, let this warm light fill your lungs. Imagine it glowing softly inside your chest. As you breathe out, imagine the light spreading gently around your chest, expanding with a soft radiance. Breathe in, and let the light expand a little further this time. Feel it growing warmer, more present. Breathe out, and let the light travel up to your neck and down past your diaphragm. It moves slowly, like honey, coating everything with warmth and ease. Breathe in, and swallow even more of this warm, vibrant light. Breathe out, and let it fill your head, your throat, your chest, your stomach. Every space within you is now glowing softly. Breathe in deeply, and fill your entire upper body with this warm, vibrant light. Your shoulders, your arms, your back, your chest, all bathed in gentle, peaceful light. Take a few more breaths now, and with each one, allow this warm, vibrant energy to intensify in your upper body. Not in an overwhelming way, but like turning up the dimmer switch just slightly. More warmth, more comfort, more peace. Think of nothing but this warm, vibrant light. If a thought comes by, perhaps something from your day, or a task for tomorrow, allow yourself to acknowledge its presence. Notice it, like watching a leaf float by on a gentle stream. And then, let it drift away. Dismiss it kindly, and refocus on the light. There will be time for those thoughts later, but not now. Now is for rest. Breathe in. Breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out. Nothing to do. Nowhere to be. Just breathing. Just light. Just peace. On your next breath in, let the warm, vibrant light begin to travel downward. Feel it reach your hips, your thighs, moving slowly and deliberately, like a warm wave washing over you. Breathe out, and allow the light to reach your knees. Feel the warmth spreading down your legs. Breathe in, and feel the light continue its gentle journey. Breathe out, and sense it flowing down your shins, to your ankles. Breathe in deeply, and let the light fill your legs all the way down to your toes. Every part of you now is surrounded by this gentle, warm glow. You are completely enveloped in comfort and peace. Breathe out, and feel your entire body relaxing more deeply than before. Breathe in, and draw in even more tranquility. Out, releasing any remaining tension. Focus now on your breath and the warm light surrounding you. Nothing but your breath and the light. In and out. Glowing and peaceful. If your mind wanders, that's perfectly natural. Simply guide it back, gently, to your breath, to the light, to this present moment. Relax. Let go. You are safe. You are comfortable. You are exactly where you need to be. Your body knows how to rest. Your mind knows how to release. And tonight, you're giving yourself permission to do both. There's nothing you need to figure out, nothing you need to solve, nothing you need to remember right now. Just breathe, and listen, and drift. As we move into tonight's story, allow yourself to let go even more. Let the words wash over you like a gentle tide. You don't need to follow every detail or remember every word. Simply receive the story as a gift, a soft companion as you journey towards sleep. And now, let us begin. In the quiet coastal town of Lagos, in southern Portugal, the late afternoon sun casts long golden shadows across cobblestone streets still warm from the day. The year is 1460, and in a modest residence overlooking the harbour, a young boy named Bartholomew Diaz watches ships return from the sea, their sails catching the last light like the wings of tired birds coming home to rest. He doesn't yet know that he will one day sail farther than any of these weathered vessels, that his name will be whispered in navigation schools for centuries to come. For now, he simply watches, and dreams, and breathes in the salt air that carries with it the promise of distant horizons. But to understand why Bartholomew Diaz would eventually stand at the helm of ships pushing into unknown waters, we must first understand the world he was born into, a world on the cusp of transformation, where the map of the known earth was about to be redrawn by courage, curiosity, and the restless human spirit. Portugal in the mid-15th century was a small kingdom perched on the edge of Europe, looking out toward an ocean that seemed to have no end. For generations, European merchants had hungered for the spices of the East: cinnamon, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, luxuries that flavored food, preserved meat, and even masked the taste of spoilage in an age before refrigeration. These precious goods traveled along the ancient Silk Road, passing through countless hands, through Muslim territories, through Venice's merchant networks, each middleman adding cost until a pound of pepper in Lisbon might be worth more than a laborious monthly wages. But there was another route, a theoretical one, that sailors whispered about in taverns and scholars debated in universities. What if one could sail south, down the coast of Africa, around its southern tip, and then north and east to India? What if the treasures of the Orient could be reached by sea, bypassing the overland routes, the tariffs, the merchants who controlled the flow of Eastern goods into Europe? This dream took root most firmly in the mind of one man, Prince Henry of Portugal, known to history as Henry the Navigator, though he himself rarely sailed. From his position at Sagres, on Portugal's southwestern cape where the land falls away into the Atlantic, Henry established what was essentially the world's first navigation research institute. Here, cartographers drew maps, astronomers calculated latitudes, shipwrights designed vessels that could handle ocean swells, and captains shared knowledge of winds and currents. Henry's passion for exploration was partly spiritual. He genuinely hoped to find the legendary Christian kingdom of Prester John, believed to exist somewhere in Africa or Asia, and to forge an alliance against Muslim powers. But it was also intensely practical. Portugal was small, resource-poor compared to its neighbors, and needed new sources of wealth. The sea offered possibilities that the land did not. Beginning in 1419, under Henry's patronage, Portuguese expeditions began creeping down the African coast, each voyage pushing a little farther than the last. These were not grand armadas but modest expeditions, often just a caravel or two, testing the waters, mapping coastlines, noting where fresh water could be found. In 1434, Gilles rounded Cape Bojador, a milestone that doesn't sound particularly impressive until you understand the terror this cape inspired. Medieval sailors believed that beyond Bojador, the sea boiled under an equatorial sun, that ships would be destroyed, that monsters lurked in those southern waters. When Eanes returned safely, having proven these fears groundless, it was as if a psychological barrier had been broken. The expeditions continued with renewed vigor. By 1460, the year Prince Henry died, the year young Bartholomew Dias was learning to read the stars, Portuguese ships had reached Sierra Leone, more than 2,000 miles down the African coast. But Henry's death did not end Portugal's maritime ambitions. His nephew, King Afonso V, and later King João II, who ascended to the throne in 1481, continued the work. João II was particularly committed to finding the sea route to India. He understood what his great-uncle had understood, that whoever controlled direct access to the spice trade would command immense wealth and power. And so the expeditions continued, year after year, each captain adding a few more miles to the charts, each crew returning with stories of tropical storms, unfamiliar stars, coastlines that seemed to stretch on forever southward. Into this world of maritime ambition, Bartholomew Dias grew to manhood. Born around 1450, likely into a family with seafaring connections, Dias entered royal service and proved himself a capable navigator and leader. By the 1480s, he was superintendent of the royal warehouses, a position of trust and responsibility. But more importantly, he was a man with experience at sea, with an understanding of ship handling, weather patterns, and the temperament required to lead men into unknown waters. In 1486, King João II made a decision that would change the course of history. He appointed Bartholomew Dias to command an expedition with a clear objective: to sail as far south along the African coast as possible, and if God and fortune permitted, to round the southern tip of Africa and confirm once and for all whether a sea route to India existed. Dias was given 3 ships. 2 were sturdy caravels, the São Cristóvão and the São Pantaleo, swift vessels with triangular lateen sails that could tack into the wind, ideal for coastal exploration. The 3rd was a supply ship, designed to carry extra provisions and equipment. Dias would command the São Cristóvão himself. His brother Pero commanded the São Pantaleo. João Infante, an experienced captain, commanded the supply ship. The crew totaled perhaps 50 or 60 men, sailors, soldiers, a few priests to tend to spiritual needs, interpreters who spoke African languages. These were not noble adventurers seeking glory but working men, rope handlers and carpenters, cooks and able seamen, men who understood that this voyage might last months or even years, that they might never see home again. Yet they signed on, drawn by the promise of wages, perhaps by curiosity, perhaps simply because the sea was what they knew. In August of 1487, on a morning when the harbour at Lisbon was busy with the sounds of gulls and merchants and the creak of ship rigging, Bartholomew Dias's small fleet cast off and pointed their bows southward. The Portuguese king himself may have been there to watch them depart, knowing that he was sending these men toward the unknown, toward waters that might hold answers to questions Europe had been asking for generations. The first weeks were familiar enough. The ships followed the established route down the African coast, past places Portuguese sailors had visited many times before. They stopped at the island of São Tiago in the Cape Verde archipelago to take on fresh water and provisions. Then they continued south, crossing the equator where the constellations shifted overhead and the North Star disappeared below the horizon, leaving only the Southern Cross to guide them. At certain points along the coast, Dias erected stone pillars called podros, tall stone crosses inscribed with the Portuguese coat of arms and the date of passage. These were territorial markers, certainly, but they were also navigational aids for future expeditions, and perhaps something more, reminders that humans had stood in these remote places, that even at the edge of the known world, courage and curiosity had left their mark. By December, the expedition had reached the furthest point of previous Portuguese exploration, somewhere near modern-day Namibia. From here on, every mile would be new, uncharted, a contribution to humanity's understanding of the planet's shape and extent. And so they sailed on, into waters no European had ever navigated, under skies that wheeled with unfamiliar stars, their small ships rising and falling on the great swells of the South Atlantic. At night, lying in their hammocks below deck, the sailors must have wondered what lay ahead. Would the coast curve eastward as they hoped? Or would it continue forever south, eventually leading them into frozen seas where ice would crush their wooden hulls? Bartholomew Dias stood at the rail of the São Cristóvão, watching the coastline slip past, making notes, calculating latitudes, writing observations in the ship's log by candlelight. He was methodical, patient, determined. He knew that every detail mattered: the depth of water, the color of the sea, the direction of currents, the behavior of birds and fish. All of this information would help those who came after. But even Dias, for all his preparation and skill, could not have fully anticipated what lay ahead, the storms that would test his ships and crew to their limits, the moment of discovery that would justify years of Portuguese exploration, and the difficult decisions he would soon face as his men, exhausted and frightened, would begin to question how much further they should push into the unknown. For now, though, there was only the gentle rock of the ship, the sound of water against the hull, the infinite patience required to sail into mystery, 1 nautical mile at a time, trusting in skill, in courage, and in the gradual accumulation of knowledge that is humanity's most enduring voyage of all. Rest now, as those sailors rested, as the ships moved through darkness toward a dawn they could not yet imagine, as the world slowly, inevitably, revealed itself to those brave or stubborn or curious enough to keep sailing toward the edges of every map. The African coastline had been Bartholomew Diaz's constant companion for months now, a ribbon of sand and rock stretching endlessly to the south, sometimes close enough to see details of the shore, sometimes just a dark line on the horizon. But in early January of 1488, as the small fleet pressed on beyond the furthest reach of previous expeditions, the wind began to change. At first, it was a blessing. A strong wind from the south-southeast filled the sails and pushed the ships forward with purpose and speed. But then the wind strengthened further, and the blessing became something else entirely. The sky darkened to the color of bruised iron. The seas grew confused and angry, waves building higher than the ship's masts, coming from multiple directions at once as if the ocean itself couldn't decide which way to throw its weight. For 13 days, nearly 2 weeks, the storm raged. The ships were driven helplessly before it, their crews working in shifts to keep water pumped from the holds, to keep the vessels pointed into the waves so they wouldn't be rolled and capsized. Men lashed themselves to the deck to avoid being swept overboard. Cooking fires couldn't be lit, so they ate cold rations when they could eat at all, though many were too seasick to hold down food. Sleep came in brief, exhausted snatches between the endless work of survival. Bartholomew Diaz, soaked to the skin, his hands raw from hauling on ropes, made decisions hour by hour. There were no charts for this. No previous captain's experience to draw upon. Just instinct, seamanship, and prayer. The supply ship, the slowest of the 3 vessels, had been left behind days earlier at a place they'd called Angra-dos-Ilhéus, the Bay of Isles, with 9 men aboard and instructions to wait for the expedition's return. Now it was just the 2 caravels, and Diaz could only hope that his brother's ship, the São Pantaleo, was still afloat somewhere in this chaos. When the storm finally spent itself and the winds eased, the exhausted crews found themselves in strange waters. The sea was different here. Colder, a different color, with different currents. When the skies cleared enough for Diaz to take a sun sight with his astrolabe, he calculated their latitude and realized something remarkable. The storm had driven them far south, but also, and this was the crucial detail, it had driven them west, away from the African coast. They had been blown, quite literally, around the southern tip of Africa without realizing it. When Diaz ordered the ships to turn east, expecting to find the African coastline where it had always been, to the east of their position, they sailed for days and found nothing but open ocean. Then he made a bold decision: turn north. And when they did, after several more days of sailing, a lookout's cry brought every man on deck. Land. Mountains rising from the sea. But this coastline ran east to west, not north to south as it had for thousands of miles. They had done it. They had rounded Africa. The continent did have a southern end, and they had passed it. On February 3, 1488, Diaz's ships anchored in a bay they would name the Aguada de São Brás, the watering place of St. Blaise. The crews went ashore to find fresh water, and there they encountered something they hadn't expected: people. The indigenous Khoikhoi herders watched these strange visitors warily. These were pastoral people who lived along the coast with their cattle, people who had never seen a European sailing ship, had never imagined that humans could arrive from across the vast ocean. The encounter was tense. Diaz attempted to establish friendly relations. This was standard practice for Portuguese expeditions, to leave good impressions that might benefit future voyages. But there was a language barrier that the expedition's interpreters, who spoke West African languages, could not bridge. The Khoikhoi spoke an entirely different family of languages, one characterized by click consonants that the Portuguese had never heard before. A misunderstanding occurred. One of the Portuguese sailors, perhaps trying to water the ship's barrels, may have approached too close to the Khoikhoi cattle, which were precious to these herders. Or perhaps the Khoikhoi simply wanted these strangers to leave. Stones were thrown. In the confrontation that followed, one of the ship's crew threw a spear that wounded a Khoikhoi man. Diaz ordered his men back to the ships, disturbed by the violence. It was a small incident in the grand scope of exploration, but it foreshadowed the conflicts that would come as European and African worlds collided in the centuries ahead. The expedition continued eastward along the southern coast of Africa. They passed the mouth of what we now call Algoa Bay, near present-day Port Elizabeth, South Africa. Here Diaz erected another padrao, one he named after Saint Gregory. Standing there on the shore, looking out at the Indian Ocean, though he didn't yet know that's what it was, Bartholomew Diaz must have felt the weight of what he'd accomplished. The sea route to India was real. It existed. Portugal's decades-long dream was within reach. But his men were exhausted. They had been at sea for months, surviving on dwindling provisions. Their ships needed repairs. The constant battering of storms and seas had opened seams in the hulls that required constant pumping. Their clothes were rotting off their bodies from salt and mildew. And most significantly, their psychological reserves were depleted. They had sailed into the unknown for so long that many couldn't imagine sailing any further. Diaz wanted to continue. The navigational challenge that had driven him, finding whether Africa could be rounded, had been answered, but the larger mission, reaching India, remained unfulfilled. They were so close. If they could just sail on a bit further, follow this coast as it surely must curve northward toward the Indian subcontinent. But a captain, even one with royal authority, cannot completely ignore his crew's will. These were not enslaved men who could be forced at gunpoint. They were sailors who needed to work together to keep the ships functioning, and if they refused to continue, there was little Diaz could do. The sources suggest that Diaz called a council, a meeting with his officers and senior crew members. It was a remarkable bit of democracy in an age of absolute monarchies. Each man was asked to state his opinion and sign his name to it, creating a written record. The near-unanimous verdict was clear: turn back. The men were afraid, yes, but their fear was not irrational. They were thousands of miles from home in waters no European had ever navigated. They were low on food. Their ships were damaged. Winter would be coming in these southern latitudes. To push on might mean never returning at all. Bartholomew Diaz, reading these testimonies, must have felt a complex mixture of emotions. Frustration, certainly, to come so far and turn back when the goal was within reach. But perhaps also understanding. These men had trusted him into the unknown, had survived terrible storms, had pushed beyond every previous limit. They had accomplished something extraordinary. To demand more might break them entirely. He negotiated for 3 more days. "Give me 3 more days of sailing eastward," he asked, "and if we haven't found clear signs of the route to India, we'll turn for home." The men agreed. For 3 more days, the ships continued along the African coast, each day adding a few more miles to humanity's knowledge. But they found no obvious indication that India was near, no sudden northward curve of the coastline, no merchant ships from the east that might confirm they were on the right track. On the 3rd day, Diaz turned the ships around. As they retraced their path westward, he looked for the southern cape they had unknowingly rounded in the storm. When they found it, a dramatic promontory of rock jutting into the sea where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans meet, Diaz named it the Cabo das Tormentas, the Cape of Storms, in memory of the tempest that had driven them past it. But this name wouldn't last. When Diaz returned to Lisbon and reported his findings to King João II, the king would rename it. He would call it the Cabo da Boa Esperança, the Cape of Good Hope. Because that's what it represented. Hope. Hope that the sea route to India was real. Hope that Portugal's patient investment in exploration was about to pay extraordinary dividends. Hope that the map of the world was larger, more knowable, more navigable than anyone had previously imagined. The return voyage was long but less dramatic than the outbound journey. The expedition stopped again at the Bay of Isles to collect the supply ship and its crew, but they found tragedy there. Of the 9 men left behind, only 3 survived. The others had been killed in a conflict with local inhabitants, the details of which are lost to history. It was a sobering reminder of the dangers these expeditions faced, not just from the sea, but from the complex human dynamics of contact between cultures. By December 1488, 16 months after their departure, the 2 remaining ships, weathered, worn, but intact, sailed back into Lisbon harbor. They had lost men, yes, and they hadn't reached India. But they had answered the great geographical question of the age. Africa could be rounded. The sea route to the east existed. Bartholomew Diaz expected a hero's welcome. He had done what no European had done before. He had expanded Portugal's, and humanity's, understanding of the world's shape. But the reception was more muted than he might have hoped. King João II was pleased, certainly, and Diaz was rewarded. But there were political complications. The Spanish were making their own moves in exploration. Christopher Columbus was petitioning various monarchs for support of a westward route to Asia. The geopolitical situation was complex. Moreover, João II understood that knowing the route existed and actually using it to reach India were 2 different things. Diaz's expedition had revealed just how difficult and dangerous such a voyage would be. The next expedition would need to be larger, better supplied, and led by someone who could not just navigate but negotiate, someone who could establish diplomatic and commercial relations with the powerful rulers of India. Bartholomew Diaz would never lead that expedition. When Portugal finally mounted the voyage to India nearly a decade later, Diaz would be invited to participate only as a captain of one ship among many, not as the commander. That role would go to another man, someone whose name would become even more famous in the history of exploration, Vasco da Gama. But on those quiet nights in Lisbon after his return, as Diaz walked the same harbor streets where he'd watched ships as a boy, he knew what he'd accomplished. He had stood at the bottom of Africa. He had felt the waters of 2 oceans. He had looked toward India even if he hadn't reached it. He had pushed the boundary of the known world further than it had ever been pushed before. And sometimes, when the wind was right, he could smell the salt air from the harbor and remember those 13 days in the storm, when the world was nothing but wind and wave and the small defiant courage of wooden ships refusing to break, of human beings refusing to surrender to the vast indifference of the sea. The Cape of Good Hope. Esperança. Hope. That's what exploration always was, in the end. An act of hope that there was more to discover, more to understand, that the world would yield its secrets to those patient and brave enough to seek them. Rest now, as Diaz rested after his great voyage, as the world absorbed what he had learned, as the mapmakers bent over their charts and drew new lines showing that Africa had edges, that the oceans connected, that the world was both larger and smaller than anyone had imagined. While Bartholomew Diaz was making his careful way home around the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, events were unfolding in Europe that would shape the future of exploration in ways no single navigator could control. The world was being divided, not by natural boundaries of ocean and continent, but by papal decree and political negotiation, invisible lines drawn on maps that would determine which nations could claim which discoveries. The Catholic Church, in the person of the Pope, held immense authority in 15th-century Europe. Monarchs sought papal blessing for their actions, and papal pronouncements carried the weight of divine sanction. For decades, Portugal had enjoyed exclusive papal support for its African explorations. But now, another nation was entering the arena of discovery, and the Pope would be called upon to arbitrate between competing Christian kingdoms. Spain, recently unified under Ferdinand and Aragon and Isabella of Castile, was emerging as a formidable power. And Spain had found its own navigator with bold ideas. A Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, who believed he could reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic. Columbus had actually approached the Portuguese court first, seeking support for his westward voyage. King João II had listened to his proposal, consulted with his cosmographers and navigation experts, and ultimately declined. The Portuguese experts believed Columbus had underestimated the circumference of the Earth, which, ironically, they were correct about. Columbus thought Asia was much closer to Europe sailing west than it actually was. If the Americas hadn't been in the way, his crew would have perished of thirst and starvation long before reaching Japan or China. But Spain, Portugal's neighbor and rival, saw opportunity in Columbus's proposal. In 1492, the same year that Granada fell and the Reconquista was completed, Ferdinand and Isabella agreed to sponsor Columbus's voyage. That August, he set sail from Palos de la Frontera with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. On October 12, 1492, after more than 2 months at sea, Columbus made landfall in what he believed were islands off the coast of Asia. He had, of course, reached the Bahamas in the Caribbean, but he would die believing he'd found a new route to the East Indies. When he returned to Spain in March 1493 with news of his discovery, it set off a diplomatic crisis. Portugal protested immediately. Under previous papal bulls, official declarations, the Portuguese had been granted exclusive rights to all discoveries made by sailing south and east. Now Spain was claiming lands discovered by sailing west. Who had the rightful claim? The 2 kingdoms were both Catholic, both loyal to Rome, and both armed. War between them was a real possibility. Pope Alexander VI, who was Spanish by birth, a fact that certainly influenced his judgment, issued a series of papal bulls in 1493 attempting to resolve the dispute. The most significant was the Bull inter caetera, which drew a line of demarcation running from pole to pole, 100 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Spain would have exclusive rights to all discoveries west of this line, Portugal to all discoveries east of it. Portugal was outraged. The line, as drawn, gave virtually everything to Spain, including potentially the African routes that Portugal had spent decades and enormous resources exploring. King João II, who had not achieved his position through meekness, insisted on renegotiation. He was a shrewd diplomat as well as a patron of exploration, and he understood leverage. In 1494, without the Pope's direct involvement this time, Portugal and Spain met in the small Spanish town of Tordesillas and hammered out a new agreement. The Treaty of Tordesillas moved the line of demarcation to 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, much farther west than the Pope's original line. This seemingly technical adjustment had profound consequences. It meant that when Brazil was discovered 6 years later, it would fall on Portugal's side of the line, giving Portugal its vast South American colony. It also unambiguously confirmed Portugal's rights to the African route to India. The treaty was, in its way, quite remarkable. Two European kingdoms were dividing the entire non-Christian world between themselves, granting each other monopolies over vast regions that neither had fully explored, negotiating over peoples and lands they knew almost nothing about. The indigenous peoples of Africa, the Americas, and Asia had no say in this division. Neither did any other European powers. France, England, and the Netherlands would later simply ignore the treaty, claiming it had no legal force over them since they weren't parties to it. But for Portugal in 1494, the treaty was a triumph. King João II had secured papal and Spanish recognition of Portugal's exclusive right to the eastern route. The path to India was legally theirs. Now they just needed to actually complete the journey that Diaz had shown was possible. But João II would not live to see it happen. In 1495, at the age of 40, he died, possibly of dropsy or kidney disease. He was succeeded by his cousin, Manuel I, who would become known as Manuel the Fortunate. Fortunate because the discoveries and wealth that his predecessors had invested in would come to fruition during his reign. Manuel I inherited not just a kingdom but a grand strategy nearly a century in the making. From Prince Henry the Navigator's first tentative expeditions in the 1420s, through decades of incremental progress down the African coast, through Diaz's dramatic rounding of the Cape, Portugal had been building toward one goal: direct access to the spice trade of India. Now, at the end of the 15th century, with the route proven and Portugal's exclusive rights secured, it was time to complete the mission. But who should lead this crucial expedition? It needed to be someone with navigation skills, certainly, but also someone who could negotiate with powerful Eastern rulers, establish commercial relationships, and represent Portugal's interests in sophisticated diplomatic settings. The captain would need to be bold enough to handle the dangers of the voyage but also subtle enough to navigate complex political situations in India. Manuel I considered his options carefully. Bartholomew Diaz was an obvious candidate. He knew the route, he'd proven his skill and courage. But for reasons that remain somewhat unclear, Manuel looked elsewhere. Perhaps he wanted someone with a different temperament. Perhaps there were political considerations. Perhaps Diaz, who had turned back before reaching India, was seen as too cautious. The man Manuel chose was Vasco da Gama, and it was a choice that would prove both brilliant and ruthless. Da Gama came from a minor noble family in the town of Sines, south of Lisbon. His father, Estevão da Gama, had been a knight in the service of Prince Henry's court and had some maritime experience. Vasco was born around 1460 or 1469, the exact date is uncertain, and had grown up in the same world of maritime ambition as Diaz, though perhaps with better social connections. What made da Gama particularly suitable was his combination of skills. He had studied navigation and mathematics, understanding the technical aspects of long-distance sailing. He had also studied astronomy, which was essential for celestial navigation in southern latitudes where the North Star couldn't be seen. But unlike Diaz, who was primarily a navigator, da Gama had experience in diplomacy and had served the crown in various administrative capacities. He was known to be determined, even ruthless when necessary, qualities that would serve Portugal's interests in the competitive and sometimes violent world of Indian Ocean trade. The expedition that Manuel I authorized was far more substantial than Diaz's had been. Where Diaz had 3 modestly-sized ships, da Gama would have 4 vessels and a crew of about 170 men. The flagship was the São Gabriel, which da Gama would command personally. His brother Paulo da Gama would captain the São Rafael. Nicolau Coelho, an experienced navigator, would command the smaller, faster Caravel Berrio. And there was a supply ship, loaded with extra provisions for what everyone knew would be a very long voyage. The ships were specially constructed and equipped for the journey. Their hulls were reinforced. They carried the latest navigation instruments, multiple astrolabes for measuring the altitude of celestial bodies, cross-staffs, compasses, hourglasses for measuring time, and lead lines for sounding depths. They also carried something Diaz's ships hadn't: interpreters who spoke Arabic, the lingua franca of Indian Ocean trade. This was crucial. If they reached India, they would need to communicate with Muslim merchants and rulers who controlled much of the trade in that region. The ships also carried goods for trade: Portuguese cloth, tools, glass beads, coral, and other items that the Portuguese hoped would be valued in Eastern markets. They carried gifts for rulers, fine textiles, religious objects, and other precious items meant to impress and curry favor. And they carried weapons, cannons, crossbows, swords, and armor. This was not just an expedition of discovery but a commercial and potentially military venture. Bartholomew Diaz played a significant role in the preparations. His experience was invaluable, and Manuel I wisely consulted him extensively. Diaz advised on the route, on where to find water along the African coast, on where the winds and currents would be favorable or challenging. He helped select the crew members who had experience in southern waters. Some sources suggest he even supervised aspects of the ship's construction, ensuring they were sturdy enough for the journey. But there must have been some bitterness in this for Diaz. He was helping prepare another man to complete the journey he himself had pioneered, to receive the glory that might have been his if circumstances had been different. Yet he performed his duties faithfully. Perhaps he understood that exploration was larger than any individual ego, that each expedition built on the ones before, that his own achievement wasn't diminished by da Gama's opportunity. Diaz would actually sail with the expedition, but only for the first leg. He was given command of one of the ships bound for the São Jorge da Mina, the Portuguese fort and trading post in present-day Ghana. He would accompany da Gama's fleet as far as the Cape Verde Islands, then branch off on his own mission while da Gama continued to India. It was a consolation prize, perhaps, but also a mark of continued trust and responsibility. As the departure date approached in 1497, The ships were blessed by priests. The crews attended Mass, confessed their sins, prepared their souls for a journey from which they might not return. On July 8, 1497, 9 years after Diaz's return, Vasco da Gama's fleet sailed from Lisbon, following the now familiar route down the African coast. But da Gama would not simply retrace Diaz's coastal route. He and his pilots, advised by Diaz's experience, had learned from the earlier expedition. They understood the wind patterns better now. They knew that hugging the African coast all the way south meant fighting contrary winds and currents. So da Gama made a bold navigational decision that would become standard practice for ships sailing to India for centuries to come. After reaching the Cape Verde Islands and parting ways with Diaz, da Gama's fleet turned southwest into the open Atlantic, far from any sight of land, in a huge looping arc that took them almost to the coast of South America before turning east again toward Africa. This route, called the Volta do Mar, the turn of the sea, took advantage of the prevailing wind patterns of the South Atlantic, the great circular gyres of wind and current that, once understood, made the voyage more predictable and faster. For months, da Gama's ships sailed through empty ocean, seeing nothing but water and sky, the sun and stars their only guides. It was one of the longest open ocean passages that had ever been attempted up to that time. 3 months without sight of land, relying entirely on dead reckoning and celestial navigation. The crews must have wondered, day after day, whether they were lost, whether they would ever see land again, whether the calculations were correct. But they were correct. In November 1497, the African coast appeared on the horizon, exactly where da Gama's navigation predicted it would be. They had successfully completed the Great Ocean crossing and were approaching the Cape of Good Hope. The theoretical route had been proven practical. The sea had given up more of its secrets. Da Gama brought his ships into a bay on the western side of the cape, probably the same bay where Diaz had sheltered, to rest and prepare for the next phase of the journey. They stayed for several days, repairing equipment, taking on fresh water, allowing the crews to recover from the long ocean crossing. And then, on November 22, 1497, they rounded the Cape of Good Hope, passing the point where Diaz had turned back 9 years earlier. From here on, every mile would take them deeper into waters that no European ship had ever navigated, toward destinations that existed in European imagination but had never been reached by this route. India lay ahead, somewhere beyond the vast curve of the earth, and Vasco da Gama was determined to find it. Rest now, as the world waited for news, as the ships sailed on toward their destiny, as the patient work of decades approached its culmination, as the lines on maps began to connect, showing that the world, for all its vastness, was navigable, knowable, bound together by the courage of those willing to sail toward uncertainty. Beyond the Cape of Good Hope, the world changed. The coastline that had run relentlessly southward for thousands of miles now curved northeast, then north, opening into waters that Portuguese sailors had never seen. This was the Indian Ocean, though Vasco da Gama and his men didn't yet know its name or its vast extent. They only knew they were sailing into the unknown, following a coast that they hoped would eventually lead them to the fabled riches of India. The first stretch of this new coast was forbidding. Rocky shores, strong currents, and limited anchorages made navigation challenging. But on November 25, just 3 days after rounding the Cape, the fleet found a suitable bay where a river emptied into the sea. They anchored and went ashore, finding the land more welcoming than the barren coast further south. There were trees here, and birds, and signs of human habitation. Da Gama named this place the Rio do Infante, the River of the Prince, possibly in honor of Prince João, the son of King Manuel, or perhaps in memory of the captain João Infante who had sailed with Dias. They stayed for 8 days, resting, fishing, repairing their ships. The men caught fish in such abundance that they salted and preserved them for the journey ahead. It was a needed respite after the long ocean crossing and the tension of rounding the Cape. But the ships themselves were suffering. Months at sea had taken their toll. The constant working of the hulls in heavy seas had loosened caulking, and the vessels were leaking more than before. The crews spent days hauling the ships onto the beach at high tide, then working frantically during low tide to scrape barnacles from the hulls, replace worn rope, recaulk seams, and repair sails that had been torn and patched numerous times already. On December 8th, the feast day of the Immaculate Conception, they departed the Rio do Infante and continued northward. The coast here was rocky and dangerous, with strong currents running offshore. Progress was slow and cautious. Da Gama was methodical, taking careful measurements, noting landmarks, recording depths. Every detail might matter for future expeditions. On December 16th, they passed the farthest point that Dias had reached, the place where he had erected the Padrao of St. Gregory 9 years earlier. From this moment forward, Da Gama and his men were sailing in waters no European had ever navigated. They were adding to human knowledge with every mile, drawing the map as they went, connecting the known world to the unknown. The coast was inhabited, they could see that. Occasionally they spotted fishing boats or small settlements along the shore. On Christmas Day, 1497, they were sailing along a particularly pleasant stretch of coast. Green hills rising from the sea, river mouths creating natural harbors. Da Gama named this region Natal, the Portuguese word for Christmas, and the name would stick. Today, the South African province of KwaZulu-Natal still bears the name given by those Portuguese sailors on that distant Christmas more than 5 centuries ago. As they continued north, the encounters with local populations became more frequent and more significant. On January 11, 1498, the fleet anchored in a river mouth where they found a settlement of considerable size. The people here were Bantu-speaking, and to the Portuguese surprise and relief, they seemed friendly and curious rather than hostile. These were agricultural and fishing people who had trading connections with the broader Indian Ocean world. Unlike the Khoi people Dias had encountered at the southern tip of Africa, these East Africans had seen foreign traders before, Arab merchants who came down the coast in dhows, bringing cloth and metal goods and taking away ivory and gold. The Portuguese weren't the first strangers these people had met. Da Gama's Arabic interpreters were finally useful. Through them, a basic communication was established. The Portuguese traded copper bracelets and small bells for fresh food, chickens, goats, fresh fruit that the sailors devoured hungrily after months of ship's biscuit and salted meat. The local people seemed particularly fascinated by the Portuguese ships, which were much larger than the dhows they were accustomed to seeing. The Portuguese stayed for a month at this place, which they called the Rio do Coba, the Copper River, because of the copper ornaments the local people wore. But the extended stay wasn't entirely by choice. Many of the crew members were sick with scurvy, that terrible affliction that plagued long sea voyages before the cause was understood. Scurvy is caused by a deficiency of vitamin C, something not found in the preserved foods, salted meat, dried biscuits, wine, that made up the bulk of a sailor's diet. The symptoms began subtly: tiredness, aching limbs, a general malaise. Then came the telltale signs: bleeding gums, loosening teeth, old wounds reopening, bruises appearing without cause. In advanced stages, victims became too weak to work, then too weak to move. Without treatment, scurvy killed slowly and painfully. Da Gama's crew was suffering badly. Dozens of men were affected to varying degrees. The fresh food they obtained from the local people, fruit, vegetables, fresh meat, began to help, though the Portuguese didn't understand why. They thought it was simply the rest and the change from ship's provisions. They didn't know they were replenishing the vitamin C that had been slowly depleting from their bodies since they left Lisbon. During this enforced layover, the crews worked on the ships again. The supply ship, which had been useful for carrying extra provisions but was now mostly empty and creating more work to maintain, was stripped of anything valuable and then broken up. The supplies and equipment were distributed among the 3 remaining vessels. It was a practical decision. Fewer ships meant fewer sailors needed for watch duty, easier coordination, and faster sailing. But it also meant they had less cargo capacity for the trade goods they hoped to bring back from India. By late February, enough of the crew had recovered that Da Gama decided to continue. They sailed northward into waters that grew progressively warmer as they approached the equator. The stars overhead shifted night by night, constellations they'd known all their lives sinking toward the southern horizon while new, unfamiliar patterns rose in the north. On March 2, 1498, they sighted a town of considerable size on an island near the coast. This was Mozambique Island, and it marked their entry into a new world, the Swahili coast, where African and Arab cultures had blended over centuries to create sophisticated trading cities connected by commerce to the far reaches of the Indian Ocean. The town of Mozambique was impressive by any standard. Unlike the small settlements they'd seen further south, this was a proper port city with stone buildings, a sultan's palace, mosques with minarets, and a bustling harbor filled with dhows from Arabia and India. The people dressed in fine cotton and silk, wore gold jewelry, and clearly participated in a prosperous trading network. The Sultan of Mozambique, an Arab or Swahili ruler whose name the Portuguese recorded as Kuf, likely a Portuguese rendering of a Swahili title, initially welcomed the Portuguese, believing they might be Muslim traders from some distant land. The Portuguese, eager to gather information and establish friendly relations, didn't immediately correct this misunderstanding. Through their Arabic interpreters, the Portuguese learned crucial information. Yes, they were told, India was reachable from here. Ships sailed regularly across the Indian Ocean to the Malabar coast of southwestern India. The monsoon winds, which reversed direction with the seasons, made this possible, sailing east with one monsoon, returning west with the next. The trade was rich, African gold and ivory going east, Indian spices and textiles coming west, all mediated by Arab and Swahili merchants who had been conducting this commerce for centuries. But the welcome began to sour when the Sultan and his advisors realized the Portuguese were Christians, not Muslims. Moreover, the trade goods the Portuguese offered, copper, cloth, beads, were of poor quality compared to what the Sultan was accustomed to receiving from Indian and Arab merchants. The Portuguese began to seem less like promising new trading partners and more like poor, potentially hostile interlopers in a sophisticated commercial world that had been functioning perfectly well without them. Da Gama, sensing the changing mood and worried about being trapped in the harbor, decided to leave. But as they attempted to depart, the local pilots who had agreed to guide them out through the tricky coastal waters deliberately steered them toward shoals, apparently hoping to wreck the ships. Da Gama's own pilots noticed the deception just in time and managed to navigate clear. It was a tense moment, and it ended any pretense of friendship with Mozambique. The Portuguese fired their cannons as they left, not hitting anything, but making a statement. These were weapons unlike anything the Swahili coast had seen. The local rulers had political power and commercial wealth, but they didn't have naval artillery. This imbalance would have profound and tragic consequences in the decades to come, as Portugal used its naval superiority to muscle its way into and eventually dominate the Indian Ocean trade routes. From Mozambique, they sailed north to the port city of Mombasa, which they reached on April 7, 1498. Mombasa was even larger and more impressive than Mozambique, a major trading hub with connections throughout the Indian Ocean world. But word of the Portuguese arrival had preceded them, carried by faster coastal vessels, and the reception here was hostile from the start. The Sultan of Mombasa refused to allow the Portuguese to come ashore. At night, local boats attempted to cut the Portuguese anchors, trying to set the ships adrift so they would run aground. There were indications of a plot to board the ships and capture or kill the crews. Da Gama, increasingly wary, kept the crews on high alert. When some local officials did come aboard, Da Gama had them seized and questioned, not gently. Under duress, they confirmed that an attack had indeed been planned. The situation was deteriorating. The Portuguese were clearly unwelcome on this coast. They were strangers in a region with its own established power structures and trade networks, and they were seen, correctly, as potential threats to that established order. Da Gama needed a different approach, needed to find someone willing to help them reach India despite the resistance they were encountering. On April 14, they left Mombasa and sailed north, reaching the city-state of Malindi the next day. And here, finally, their fortunes would change in a way that would make all the difference. Malindi was a rival to Mombasa, and the Sultan of Malindi saw in these strange Portuguese visitors an opportunity to gain an advantage over his competitors. The Sultan of Malindi welcomed Da Gama warmly, not out of simple friendliness, but out of sophisticated political calculation. If these Portuguese had powerful ships and weapons, if they were indeed connected to a distant Christian kingdom, perhaps they could be useful allies. The Sultan sent gifts to the ships, fresh provisions, spices, and even a tour of his palace grounds for Da Gama and selected officers. More importantly, when Da Gama explained that he needed a pilot who could guide them across the Indian Ocean to India, the Sultan agreed to help. This was an extraordinary offer. The knowledge of monsoon patterns and the navigational skills required to cross the Indian Ocean were valuable, almost proprietary, carefully guarded by the Arab and Indian pilots who monopolized this trade. But the Sultan of Malindi provided Da Gama with an experienced pilot, possibly an Arab or possibly a Gujarati Indian, who knew the route to the Malabar coast of India intimately. The identity of this pilot has been much debated by historians. Portuguese chronicles sometimes refer to him as Malamo Kana, possibly a rendering of Mualim Kana, meaning master navigator. Some later sources identify him as Ahmed ibn Mejid, a famous Arab navigator and geographer, though this identification is disputed. Whoever he was skilled and knowledgeable, and his expertise would prove essential. On April 24, 1498, with the monsoon winds blowing favorably from the southwest, Vasco da Gama's 3 ships left Malindi and set out across the open Indian Ocean. The pilot set the course, and the ships sailed east-northeast, leaving the African coast behind, trusting to the pilot's knowledge and the favorable winds. For 23 days, they saw nothing but ocean. It was another long open water passage, similar to the Great Atlantic Crossing but with a crucial difference. This time they had someone aboard who knew exactly where they were going, who could read the subtle signs of currents and clouds and birds that indicated they were on the right track. The crew, having survived so much already, storms, scurvy, hostile ports, months away from home, must have watched the horizon with a mixture of hope and trepidation. If the pilot was trustworthy, if the monsoon winds held, if their luck and God's favor continued, they would soon reach India. They would complete the mission that Portugal had been working toward for nearly 80 years. They would connect Europe to Asia by sea, opening a route that would change the world. And on May 20th, 1498, after nearly 11 months at sea, after sailing more than 24,000 miles from Lisbon, land appeared on the horizon. Mountains, green and lush. The coast of India. They had done it. Rest now, as those sailors rested in the knowledge that their impossible journey was approaching its destination, as the old world and the new world of the East prepared to meet, as centuries of separation were about to end, as the patient work of exploration finally, incredibly, bore fruit. The mountains of the Western Ghats rose from the sea like a promise fulfilled. After months of uncertainty, after sailing past unfamiliar coasts and through unknown waters, after facing storms and sickness and the gnawing doubt that perhaps they had sailed too far, trusted too much, hoped for too much, here was India. Real, solid, green with tropical vegetation, exactly where the pilot from Malindi had said it would be. On May 20th, 1498, Vasco da Gama's 3 weathered ships approached the Malabar coast of southwestern India, near the city of Calicut. This was one of the great trading ports of the medieval world, a place where merchants from Arabia, Persia, China, and the islands of Southeast Asia converged to exchange goods that would eventually find their way to markets thousands of miles distant. Pepper and ginger, cinnamon and cardamom, precious stones and fine cotton textiles, all flowed through Calicut's bustling harbor. The city was ruled by a Hindu prince known by his title, the Zamorin, derived from Samudiri Raja, meaning Lord of the Sea. The Zamorin of Calicut presided over a cosmopolitan port where Muslims, Hindus, Christians, and Jews lived and traded side by side, where multiple languages could be heard in the markets, where tolerance of different faiths was not just an ideal but a practical necessity for maintaining the commercial networks that made everyone prosperous. The Portuguese anchored offshore and sent a small boat to investigate. What happened next has become one of history's small, poignant moments of connection across cultures. Among the people who came out in local boats to greet the strange ships was a man who spoke to the Portuguese in their own language, or close enough. "The devil take you," he reportedly said in Spanish or Portuguese. "What brought you here?" This man was likely a Tunisian or North African trader who had learned Iberian languages through commercial contacts in the Mediterranean. His greeting, profane though it was, must have seemed like a miracle to the Portuguese sailors. After months surrounded by languages they couldn't understand, here was someone who spoke words they could comprehend. Someone who could bridge the vast cultural and linguistic gap between Europe and India. Through this interpreter, Da Gama sent a message to the Zamorin. "We are ambassadors from the King of Portugal. We have come seeking Christians and spices, and we wish to establish peaceful trade relations." It was a carefully crafted message, diplomatic in tone, though not entirely accurate. The Portuguese were explorers and traders, yes, but they were also scouts for what would eventually become an imperial project of domination. The Zamorin, intrigued by these visitors from a land he'd never heard of, agreed to receive da Gama. But first, there were formalities to observe, protocols to follow. The Portuguese would need to present themselves properly, with appropriate gifts and ceremony, if they wished to be taken seriously by one of the most powerful rulers on the Malabar coast. Da Gama prepared for this crucial meeting with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Everything depended on making a good impression, on convincing the Zamorin that Portugal was worth dealing with, that this new sea route could benefit both kingdoms. On May 28, da Gama went ashore with 13 men, carrying the gifts that King Manuel I had provided for exactly this purpose. The journey to the Zamorin's palace was itself an education. Calicut was unlike anything the Portuguese had seen. The streets were crowded with people wearing colorful cotton clothing, the air filled with unfamiliar spices and incense, the architecture featuring temples with elaborate carvings of Hindu deities. Merchant stalls displayed silks from China, pearls from the Persian Gulf, diamonds from India's interior, and everywhere the precious pepper and spices that Europe craved. The Portuguese were carried through the city in palanquins, a mode of transport they'd never encountered before, borne on the shoulders of local men. They passed Hindu temples where priests performed rituals before carved stone deities. Some of the Portuguese, in their limited understanding, apparently mistook these temples for Christian churches, so desperate were they to find the Christian communities they'd been told existed somewhere in the East. They saw the images and ceremonies through the lens of their own faith, interpreting what they saw in ways that made sense to them, however inaccurately. The Zamorin's palace was spacious and elegant, built in a style completely foreign to European architectural traditions. The ruler himself reclined on a raised platform, chewing betel leaf, another custom unfamiliar to the Portuguese, surrounded by courtiers and advisors. He was bare-chested as was the custom in that climate and region, wearing fine cotton wrapped around his waist, gold jewelry on his arms and fingers. To the Portuguese, accustomed to European royal courts where monarchs wore layers of heavy clothing even in summer, this seemed almost scandalously informal. But this was a powerful ruler in his own palace, and they were the supplicants. Da Gama presented the gifts that King Manuel had sent, some coral, a few hats, small amounts of cloth, oil, honey, and butter. To Portuguese eyes, these might have seemed like reasonable diplomatic gifts. But to the Zamorin and his court, accustomed to receiving tribute from wealthy Arab and Indian merchants who traded in gold, silk, and precious gems, these gifts were almost insultingly modest. The Portuguese hadn't understood the scale of wealth and sophistication they were entering. They'd brought gifts appropriate for African coastal chiefs, not for one of India's most powerful rulers. The Zamorin was too polite to show offense openly, but his advisors, particularly the Arab Muslim merchants who dominated Calicut's trade, were immediately suspicious of these newcomers. Who were these Portuguese? What did they really want? And most importantly, would their presence threaten the established trading networks that had made everyone so prosperous? The Muslim merchants of Calicut had good reason to be concerned. For centuries, they had served as middlemen in the spice trade, buying from Indian producers and selling to European and Middle Eastern markets. The Venetians, who controlled the European end of this trade, bought from Arab merchants who bought from other Arab merchants who bought from the Muslim traders in Calicut. Each layer added profit. If the Portuguese could buy directly from Indian producers and ship spices to Europe by sea, bypassing all these middlemen, the entire lucrative system would be disrupted. Over the following days, da Gama negotiated with the Zamorin and his officials, trying to secure permission to establish a trading post and load spices for the return journey to Portugal. The Zamorin was willing, in principle. More trade meant more customs revenue for him, and competition among merchants generally drove prices up for sellers. But the Arab merchants worked behind the scenes to undermine Portuguese credibility, pointing out their poor gifts, questioning their real intentions, suggesting they might be pirates or troublemakers rather than legitimate traders. Da Gama's position was delicate. He had very little to offer in trade. The goods his ships carried were clearly not valued in this market. He had no established reputation, no letters of credit from known merchants, no network of commercial relationships. He was asking to be trusted based solely on his word and the authority of a king that no one in Calicut had heard of. Moreover, there were practical difficulties. The Portuguese ships, anchored offshore, were visited by local officials who demanded payment of customs duties according to Calicut's standard practices. Da Gama protested that he was a royal ambassador, not a mere merchant, and should be exempt from such fees. The officials insisted that everyone who traded paid customs. The negotiations grew tense and complicated. At one point, local authorities detained Da Gama and some of his men, essentially holding them as leverage to ensure the Portuguese would pay the required fees and comply with local regulations. It was not exactly imprisonment. They were treated reasonably well, but they were not free to leave. The situation highlighted just how little power the Portuguese actually had. They were strangers in a foreign land, subject to local laws and customs, dependent on the goodwill of rulers who had no particular reason to favor them. After tense negotiations and the payment of some fees, Da Gama was released. But the entire Calicut episode had been a partial failure. The Portuguese managed to purchase some spices, not nearly as much as they'd hoped, and at prices that weren't particularly favorable. They established no permanent trading post. They made no formal treaty. The Zamorin had been polite but non-committal. The Arab merchants remained hostile and suspicious. Da Gama realized that staying longer would gain them little and might actually provoke more serious conflict. On August 29, 1498, after 3 months on the Malabar coast, the 3 Portuguese ships prepared to depart. But leaving proved almost as difficult as arriving had been. The monsoon winds that had carried them swiftly to India in just 23 days were now blowing the opposite direction. This was the nature of the monsoon system, the seasonal reversal of winds that made Indian Ocean trade possible but also dictated its timing. Sailing against these contrary winds, making their way back across the Indian Ocean toward Africa, took nearly 3 months. It was a brutal passage. The ships made slow progress, tacking back and forth, fighting for every mile. Fresh water ran low. Food supplies dwindled. And scurvy returned, worse than before. Men who had recovered on the African coast now fell sick again as their bodies' vitamin C reserves depleted. The disease spread through the crews like a slow plague. Men's gums swelled and bled. Their teeth loosened and fell out. Old scars opened. They became too weak to work the ships, lying in their hammocks, helpless and in pain. By the time the ships finally reached the African coast near Mogadishu in early January 1499, after nearly 3 months at sea, approximately 30 men had died of scurvy. Nearly a third of the crew. The survivors were exhausted, malnourished, and demoralized. The grand adventure of reaching India had given way to the grim reality of just trying to survive the journey home. They made their way down the African coast, stopping at Malindi again, where the Sultan, who had proven to be their only reliable ally on this voyage, welcomed them and provided fresh provisions. Some of the sick began to recover with fresh food. But there were so many dead, so many still sick, that da Gama faced a difficult decision. He didn't have enough healthy men to properly sail all 3 ships. The São Rafael, commanded by his brother Paulo, was in the worst condition, and Paulo himself was gravely ill with what may have been tuberculosis. On January 2, 1499, somewhere near the coast of East Africa, da Gama made the hard choice to burn the São Rafael. The ship that had carried them all the way to India was stripped of everything useful, then set ablaze and left to sink in the warm waters of the Indian Ocean. It must have been a melancholy moment, watching that ship burn. Every vessel lost felt like a defeat, a concession to the brutal toll the sea was extracting. They had left Lisbon with 4 ships. Now they were down to 2. With 2 ships and barely enough men to sail them, they continued south, rounding the Cape of Good Hope in late March 1499. The Cape was difficult, as always, storms, contrary winds, the meeting of oceans creating confused seas. But they'd survived it once before, and they survived it again. Paulo da Gama was dying. His illness had worsened steadily during the voyage, and by the time they reached the Atlantic, it was clear he wouldn't survive to see Lisbon. Vasco da Gama, devoted to his brother, made another difficult decision. He left the São Gabriel under the command of one of his captains and took the faster caravel Berrio, hoping to get Paulo home alive or at least to somewhere he could die in comfort. They stopped at the Cape Verde Islands. There, in the Portuguese settlement of Santiago, far from home but at least on Portuguese soil, Paulo da Gama died. He had sailed to India and back, had been one of the few Europeans to complete that journey, had served faithfully as his brother's second-in-command. But he would never see Lisbon again. Vasco da Gama buried his brother there, a grief that must have been almost unbearable after all they'd endured together. The Berrio continued alone to Lisbon, arriving on August 29, 1499, exactly 2 years after leaving Calicut. The São Gabriel, sailing separately, arrived a few weeks later in September. Of the approximately 170 men who had departed Lisbon in July 1497, only about 54 returned. The sea had taken its toll in lives, but the mission had succeeded. Vasco da Gama had done it. He had sailed from Europe to India and back, opening the sea route that Portugal had been seeking for 80 years. He had proven that the voyage was possible, had learned the monsoon patterns, had established contact with Indian rulers, had brought back samples of the spices and goods that Europe craved. The route was dangerous, yes, and costly in lives. But it was possible. King Manuel I received the news with jubilation. Portugal had won the race. They had found the way to the east, and they had done it without Spanish help or interference. The Treaty of Tordesillas had given them legal claim to this route, and now they had the practical knowledge to exploit it. Manuel would soon style himself Lord of the Conquest, Navigation and Commerce of Ethiopia, Arabia, Persia and India. A grandiose title, certainly, but one that reflected his ambitions. Da Gama was richly rewarded. He received a pension, land grants, and noble titles. He had left Lisbon as a minor nobleman and returned as a hero of exploration, his name destined to be remembered alongside the great navigators of history. But for all the celebration, there was also a darker reality settling over the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese had arrived, and they had no intention of being just another group of merchants peacefully participating in the existing trade networks. They had cannons, they had naval superiority, and they had the backing of a European kingdom hungry for the wealth of the East. In the years that followed, Portugal would return to Indian waters not as supplicants but as conquerors, using force to establish a maritime empire that would dominate the spice trade for over a century. Rest now, as the world absorbed these changes, as the maps were redrawn, as the age of European global expansion began, as one chapter of exploration closed and another, more complex and troubling chapter opened, as the patient work of navigators gave way to the harder truths of empire. News of Vasco da Gama's successful voyage spread through Europe like wildfire. In the courts of kings and the counting houses of merchants, in the universities where scholars studied maps and in the monasteries where monks copied manuscripts, people understood that something fundamental had changed. The world had suddenly become more connected, more knowable, and for Portugal, vastly more profitable. King Manuel I wasted no time. Within months of da Gama's return, he was already planning a second expedition to India, not a small exploratory fleet of 3 or 4 ships, but a massive armada that would establish Portugal's presence in the Indian Ocean by force if necessary. This time, there would be no confusion about Portuguese intentions. They were coming to dominate the spice trade, and they had the naval power to back up their ambitions. On March 9, 1500, just 7 months after da Gama's return, a fleet of 13 ships carrying over 1,200 men departed Lisbon bound for India. This was the largest expedition Portugal had ever mounted, led by Pedro Álvares Cabral, a nobleman with court connections but limited sailing experience. The fleet included soldiers, priests to establish churches, officials to administer trade, and ships loaded with trade goods and weapons. Among the captains sailing with Cabral was Bartholomew Dias. After all his years of service, after pioneering the route around Africa, after advising da Gama's successful voyage, Dias was finally getting another chance to sail south. He commanded 1 ship in this larger fleet, no longer the expedition leader but still contributing his invaluable experience to Portugal's expanding maritime empire. The 1500 expedition followed the same strategy da Gama had used. The great sweeping arc across the Atlantic, the Volta do Mar, to catch favorable winds. But this time, the fleet swung even farther west than da Gama had, and on April 22, 1500, they made an unexpected discovery. Land appeared on the western horizon, a coast that shouldn't have been there according to their charts. They had reached Brazil. Whether this was pure accident or whether Cabral had secret instructions to investigate rumors of land in that direction remains debated by historians. But the timing was remarkably fortunate for Portugal. Under the Treaty of Tordesillas, this newly discovered land fell just inside Portugal's zone, giving them claim to what would become one of the largest and richest colonies in the Americas. Cabral stayed in Brazil for just over a week, long enough to take on fresh water, explore the coast briefly, and claim the land for Portugal. He sent 1 ship back to Lisbon with news of the discovery, then continued with the rest of the fleet toward India, sailing southeast across the Atlantic toward the Cape of Good Hope. But the sea, which had allowed Dias to round the Cape successfully 12 years earlier, was not as forgiving this time. On May 24, 1500, as the fleet approached the Cape, a violent storm struck with terrifying ferocity. The ships were scattered, tossed by winds and waves that seemed to come from every direction at once. Sailors worked frantically to keep their vessels pointed into the wind, to keep from being rolled and swamped by the mountainous seas. 4 ships were lost in that storm. They simply disappeared, swallowed by the ocean, taking their crews with them. Among those lost was Bartholomew Diaz's vessel. The man who had first rounded the Cape of Good Hope, who had proven that Africa had a southern end, who had opened the way for everything that followed, died in sight of the cape he had discovered. The Cape of Good Hope, which King João II had named so optimistically, had become Diaz's grave. There's a bitter poetry in this. Diaz had survived the 13-day storm of 1488, had navigated unknown waters, had brought his crews home safely. But in 1500, returning to the same waters as an experienced captain in a larger, better-equipped fleet, the sea claimed him. He was approximately 50 years old. His body was never recovered. The exact location of the wreck is unknown. The man who had added so much to humanity's geographical knowledge left no grave marker, only a legacy marked on every map that shows the southern tip of Africa. The remaining 9 ships of Cabral's fleet continued to India, shaken by the loss but determined to complete the mission. They reached Calicut in September 1500, and this time the Portuguese took a harder line. They had cannons, they had soldiers, and they were prepared to use force to establish favorable trading terms. Initially, the Zamorin of Calicut seemed willing to negotiate. Cabral was permitted to establish a trading post, a feitoria, where Portuguese merchants could live year-round, store goods, and conduct business. It seemed like progress, exactly what da Gama had failed to achieve 2 years earlier. The Portuguese began trading, loading their ships with pepper and other spices, imagining that they were on their way to establishing a profitable commercial relationship. But the Arab merchants of Calicut, who had been suspicious of da Gama, were now openly hostile to this new, larger Portuguese presence. They saw clearly what was happening. The Portuguese were trying to bypass the traditional trading networks, to buy directly from producers and ship directly to Europe. Every pound of pepper the Portuguese bought was a pound that wouldn't flow through the traditional Arab-controlled channels. The economic threat was existential. In December 1500, a group of armed men, possibly Arab merchants, possibly their hired agents, attacked the Portuguese trading post. The attack was sudden and violent. Approximately 50 Portuguese, including the factor, trading representative, that Cabral had appointed, were killed. The trading post was burned. It was a clear message. The Portuguese were not welcome. Their attempts to muscle into the spice trade would be resisted. Cabral's response was swift and brutal. He ordered his ships to bombard Calicut from the harbor. The Portuguese cannons, far more powerful than any weapons the city possessed, fired into the densely populated port area. Buildings collapsed. Ships in the harbor were destroyed. Civilians died alongside any combatants. The bombardment continued for an entire day, a demonstration of European naval firepower that had never been seen in these waters before. Then Cabral did something that would set the tone for Portuguese actions in the Indian Ocean for decades to come. His men captured an Arab merchant ship in the harbor, a large vessel loaded with trade goods and carrying many people. Cabral ordered everyone aboard killed and the ship burned. Contemporary accounts suggest that hundreds of people died in this act: merchants, sailors, passengers. It was a war crime by any modern definition, a massacre designed to terrorize and to send a message: resist Portuguese trade demands and face overwhelming violence. After this display of brutality, Cabral sailed south along the coast to the rival city of Cochin, where the local ruler, in conflict with the Zamorin of Calicut, was more willing to deal with the Portuguese. At Cochin and at nearby Cananor, Cabral managed to establish trading relationships and load his ships with spices. In January 1501, the fleet began the journey home. 6 of the 9 ships that had survived the Cape Storm made it back to Lisbon, arriving in June and July of 1501 with holds full of pepper, cinnamon, and other valuable spices. Despite the loss of ships and men, despite the violence and the burned trading post in Calicut, the expedition was deemed a commercial success. The spices sold in Lisbon for prices that more than covered the expedition's costs, even accounting for the lost ships. King Manuel I immediately began planning an even larger follow-up expedition. This time, Vasco da Gama would return to India, not as an explorer but as the commander of a powerful fleet with explicit instructions to use force to secure Portuguese trading privileges. In February 1502, da Gama departed Lisbon with a fleet of 20 ships, an armada, really, not an exploring expedition. This was a show of force, a statement that Portugal intended to control the Indian Ocean spice trade by military might. Da Gama had learned from his first voyage. He knew that the Arab merchants would resist, that force would be necessary, and he was prepared to use it without hesitation. When the fleet reached the Indian Ocean, da Gama began a campaign of naval terrorism designed to break Arab control of the spice trade. He intercepted Arab merchant vessels, seizing their cargoes and often killing their crews and passengers. In one particularly horrific incident, he captured a large Arab merchant ship called the Mary, which was returning from Mecca carrying pilgrims, merchants, and their families, possibly 200 to 380 people aboard, including women and children. Da Gama ordered the ship to be looted of its valuable cargo. Then, despite pleas for mercy, he had the ship set on fire with all the people still locked inside. Those who tried to jump into the sea to escape the flames were shot with crossbows or hacked with swords if they tried to climb aboard Portuguese vessels. Contemporary accounts describe the screams of the dying, the desperate attempts of parents to save their children. The Portuguese sailors watched as the ship burned to the waterline and sank, taking everyone aboard to the bottom of the ocean. This atrocity was not the action of a rogue captain acting against orders. It was deliberate policy, approved at the highest levels. The goal was to terrorize Arab and Indian merchants into abandoning the spice trade, or at least into accepting Portuguese dominance of it. The message was clear: trade on Portuguese terms or die. When da Gama reached Calicut in October 1502, he made no pretense of peaceful negotiation. He demanded that the Zamorin expel all Arab merchants from the city, an impossible demand that would have destroyed Calicut's economy. When the Zamorin refused, da Gama bombarded the city again, even more extensively than Cabral had done. He also captured several Indian fishing boats, had the approximately 30 fishermen aboard killed, and then had their bodies mutilated, hands, ears, and noses cut off, and sent ashore as a message to the Zamorin. These were calculated acts of terror, designed to break the will of anyone who might resist Portuguese commercial demands. And they worked, at least in the short term. Several Indian rulers, terrified by Portuguese naval power and the evident willingness to use extreme violence, agreed to sign treaties granting the Portuguese favorable trading terms and the right to establish fortified trading posts. Da Gama's fleet loaded with spices and returned to Lisbon in September 1503, having established by force what diplomacy had failed to achieve: Portuguese dominance of key points in the Indian Ocean spice trade. He was again celebrated as a hero, his brutality either unknown to or accepted by the Portuguese court and public. After all, he had brought back wealth, and he had secured Portugal's position in the East. Over the next decade, Portugal tightened its grip on the Indian Ocean. In 1505, King Manuel sent Francisco de Almeida as the first viceroy of Portuguese India, with a fleet of 22 ships and clear instructions to build a chain of fortresses along the African and Indian coasts. These weren't just trading posts but military strongholds designed to control strategic points and dominate sea lanes. In 1509, the Portuguese won a decisive naval battle off the coast of Diu against a combined fleet of Egyptian, Gujarati, and Calicut forces. This Battle of Diu established Portuguese naval supremacy in the Indian Ocean. The traditional powers of the region, the Mamluks of Egypt, the Ottomans, the various Indian sultans, had ships and men but lacked the naval artillery and ship design that gave the Portuguese such an overwhelming advantage. In 1510, the Portuguese captured Goa on the west coast of India, which would become the capital of Portuguese India and remain under Portuguese control for over 450 years, until 1961. In 1511, they took Malacca in present-day Malaysia, controlling the strategic strait through which much of the spice trade passed. They established fortified trading posts in the Moluccas, the fabled spice islands where cloves and nutmeg grew. By 1515, just 18 years after Da Gama's first voyage, Portugal controlled a maritime empire stretching from Brazil in the west to the Spice Islands in the east. It was an empire unlike any that had existed before, not a continuous territorial domain but a network of fortified ports and sea lanes, held together by naval power and the knowledge of monsoon winds and ocean currents that Portuguese navigators had painstakingly accumulated. The spice trade that had enriched Arab, Indian, and Venetian merchants for centuries was now largely in Portuguese hands. Pepper that had once traveled overland through multiple middlemen now sailed directly from India to Lisbon in Portuguese ships. The price of spices in Europe dropped even as Portuguese profits soared. Venice's economy, so dependent on the spice trade, began a slow decline. The Mediterranean, which had been the center of European commerce for millennia, was being eclipsed by the Atlantic. But this Portuguese empire was built on a foundation of violence. The peaceful trading networks that had connected the Indian Ocean world for centuries were disrupted by European naval aggression. Cities were bombarded. Ships were sunk. Merchants and sailors were killed, sometimes in horrific ways designed to terrorize. The sophisticated, relatively tolerant commercial culture of the Indian Ocean, where Muslim, Hindu, Jewish, and Christian merchants had traded side by side for generations, was forced to adapt to Portuguese demands backed by cannon fire. Vasco da Gama, the navigator who had found the sea route to India, became the admiral who helped establish Portuguese dominance through terror. In 1524, he would return to India one final time as viceroy, but he died there of illness just a few months after arriving. His body was eventually returned to Portugal and buried with honors appropriate to one of the nation's greatest heroes. Bartholomew Dias, who had started it all, who had proven that Africa could be rounded, had no such honored grave. He rested somewhere at the bottom of the Atlantic, near the cape he had discovered, his body long since claimed by the sea he had navigated so skillfully. Rest now, As the age of exploration gave way to the age of empire, as the routes so patiently mapped became highways of commerce and conquest, as the world grew smaller and more connected but also more violent, as the consequences of those brave voyages rippled outward through centuries. In the quiet archives of Lisbon, in the maritime museums of Portugal, in the stone monuments that mark the departure points of those ancient expeditions, the legacy of Dias and da Gama lives on. But their legacy is complex, a mixture of human courage and human cruelty, of genuine discovery and brutal conquest, of exploration that expanded knowledge and exploitation that caused suffering. The voyages of Bartholomew Dias and Vasco da Gama fundamentally changed the world in ways that are still felt today, more than 5 centuries later. They opened a new era in human history, the age of global connection, when no part of the world remained permanently isolated from any other part, when events on one continent could have immediate consequences on another. The sea route to India that they pioneered remained the primary connection between Europe and Asia for over 400 years, until the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. Every year, hundreds of ships followed the path they had traced, around Africa, across the Indian Ocean, carrying goods, people, and ideas between continents. The route became so established, so fundamental to global commerce, that it's hard now to imagine a time when it was unknown, when reaching India from Europe by sea was considered nearly impossible. The economic impact was profound and immediate. Before da Gama's voyage, a pound of pepper in Europe might cost the equivalent of a skilled worker's weekly wages, having passed through numerous middlemen from India to Arabia to Venice to northern Europe. Within a few decades of the Portuguese opening the direct sea route, spice prices in Europe had dropped dramatically, not to modern levels, certainly, but enough to transform them from rare luxuries affordable only to the wealthy into commodities that middle-class households could purchase. This price revolution had winners and losers. European consumers benefited from access to spices, textiles, and other Eastern goods at lower prices. Portuguese merchants and the Portuguese crown grew wealthy from the trade. But the traditional middlemen, the Arab merchants who had controlled the trade for centuries, the Venetian traders who had dominated the European end, saw their profits and power decline. Entire cities whose prosperity had been built on the spice trade, like Venice and Alexandria, entered periods of economic stagnation. The Portuguese maritime empire itself, built so rapidly in the early 1500s, proved difficult to maintain over the long term. Portugal was a small country. Even today it has a population of only about 10 million people, and in the 16th century it was far smaller. Maintaining fortresses and fleets across 3 continents, thousands of miles from home, stretched Portuguese resources to the breaking point. By the late 1500s, other European powers were challenging Portuguese dominance. The Dutch, the English, and the French all began sending their own expeditions to Asia, following the routes that Portuguese navigators had mapped. The Dutch, in particular, proved to be formidable competitors. They established the Dutch East India Company in 1602, one of the first joint stock companies, a new form of business organization that allowed them to raise capital more effectively than the Portuguese crown monopoly system. By the mid-1600s, the Dutch had taken control of many Portuguese holdings in Asia, including the crucial Spice Islands and Malacca. The English were establishing their own presence in India, which would eventually grow into the British Raj. The Portuguese held on to some of their territories. Goa remained under Portuguese control until 1961, and Macau until 1999, but the brief period of Portuguese dominance over Asian trade was effectively over by the mid-17th century. Yet the impact of those initial Portuguese voyages extended far beyond economics and imperial competition. They fundamentally changed how Europeans understood the world and their place in it. Medieval European worldviews had been relatively limited, focused on Europe, the Mediterranean, and the biblical lands of the Middle East. The existence of sophisticated civilizations in India and China was known, but only vaguely, through second-hand accounts. The Portuguese voyages brought Europeans into direct contact with these civilizations. Portuguese sailors, merchants, and missionaries saw with their own eyes the great cities of India, the temples and palaces, the complex social systems and sophisticated technologies. They encountered religious and philosophical traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, that challenged European assumptions about religion and spirituality. This direct contact forced a re-evaluation of European assumptions about cultural superiority. Yes, Europeans had naval supremacy thanks to their cannons and ship designs. But Indian mathematics was more advanced than European mathematics in some respects. The concept of zero, the decimal system, trigonometric functions had all been developed in India and were only gradually being adopted in Europe. Chinese technology, particularly in areas like printing and metallurgy, was often superior to European equivalents. Islamic astronomy and medicine had preserved and extended Greek knowledge that had been largely lost in medieval Europe. The Portuguese voyages, followed by Spanish, Dutch, and English expeditions, began a process of global intellectual exchange that would accelerate over the following centuries. European scientists studied Indian and Chinese texts. Asian goods, not just spices but also cotton textiles, porcelain, tea, transformed European material culture. Ideas flowed both ways, though not equally. European colonialism meant that this exchange was always unbalanced, always shaped by power relationships. The navigational achievements of Diaz and da Gama also advanced the science of geography and cartography significantly. Before their voyages, the size and shape of Africa were subjects of speculation and fantasy. Medieval maps showed Africa extending indefinitely southward, or connected to Antarctica in a great southern continent, or terminating in impassable burning seas. Diaz proved that Africa had a southern cape, that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans connected, that the continent was circumnavigable. The knowledge that Portuguese navigators accumulated about winds, currents, and seasonal weather patterns in the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean was systematized and passed down. The Volta do Mar route, that great sweeping arc across the Atlantic, became standard practice for ships sailing to the Cape of Good Hope or to Brazil. The understanding of monsoon patterns in the Indian Ocean, learned from Arab and Indian pilots but refined through Portuguese experience, became part of European maritime knowledge. Portuguese charts and rutters, books of sailing directions, were jealously guarded secrets, treated as state property not to be shared with rival powers. But over time, this knowledge spread. Dutch and English navigators stole or copied Portuguese charts, learned from captured Portuguese pilots, and added their own observations. By the mid-1600s, the basic geography of the world's coastlines and the major wind and current patterns of the world's oceans were reasonably well understood by European navigators. This knowledge had profound implications beyond trade. It made possible the European colonization of the Americas, since ships could now reliably cross the Atlantic and return. It enabled the circumnavigation of the globe. Ferdinand Magellan's expedition of 1519 to 1522 relied heavily on Portuguese navigational knowledge, and Magellan himself was a Portuguese navigator sailing for Spain. The age of exploration gave way to the age of colonialism, as Europeans used their naval superiority and geographical knowledge to establish control over vast territories in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The human cost of this expansion was immense and is now better understood and acknowledged than it was for most of the intervening centuries. The violence that characterized Portuguese establishment of their Indian Ocean Empire, the bombardments of cities, the massacres of merchant crews, the use of terror to enforce commercial demands, set patterns that other European powers would follow. The Portuguese also pioneered the Atlantic slave trade, using their knowledge of African coasts and Atlantic wind patterns to transport enslaved Africans to their colonies in Brazil and elsewhere. Indigenous populations throughout the world suffered from European contact, from disease, from displacement, from forced labor, from cultural destruction. The sophisticated trading networks of the Indian Ocean, which had operated for centuries with relatively little violence, were disrupted by European naval aggression. The long-term consequences included the colonization of nearly all of Africa and Asia by European powers, the suppression of indigenous cultures and political systems, and economic exploitation that has had lasting effects into the 21st century. Modern assessments of Diaz and da Gama must acknowledge both their genuine achievements as navigators and the darker implications of what they set in motion. They were skilled sailors, brave men who ventured into unknown waters at great personal risk. Diaz's decision to sail into that 13-day storm rather than turning back required courage. Da Gama's navigation of the open Atlantic, sailing for months out of sight of land with only the stars to guide him, demonstrated remarkable skill and confidence in his mathematical and astronomical knowledge. But they were also agents of an expansionist European kingdom whose ultimate goals included not just trade but dominance, not just knowledge but control. Da Gama's burning of the Mary, with hundreds of pilgrims locked inside, cannot be explained away as a product of its time. Even by the standards of the early 16th century, it was recognized as an atrocity, though one that served Portuguese interests and was therefore approved by his superiors. The navigators themselves were products of their culture and their time, shaped by the values and assumptions of late medieval and early Renaissance Europe. They believed, as most Europeans of their era did, in the superiority of Christianity over other religions, in the right of Christian kingdoms to claim lands inhabited by non-Christians, in the legitimacy of using force to advance commercial and religious goals. These beliefs, which seem so problematic from a modern perspective, were largely unquestioned in their world. In Portugal today, both Diaz and da Gama are honored as national heroes. The monument to the discoveries in Lisbon, built in the 1960s, features statues of both men among the Portuguese explorers and navigators depicted on its sides. Streets, schools, and public squares are named after them. Their voyages are taught in schools as defining moments in Portuguese history, as sources of national pride. Yet there is also, increasingly, a recognition of the complexity of this legacy. Museums that once celebrated the age of discovery uncritically now include exhibits about the impacts on indigenous peoples, about slavery, about the violence that accompanied Portuguese expansion. There is a growing awareness that the same voyages that brought Portuguese glory also brought suffering to millions of people in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The Vasco da Gama Bridge in Lisbon, opened in 1998 on the 500th anniversary of his arrival in India, is one of the longest bridges in Europe, a massive modern structure that speaks to Portugal's continued pride in its maritime heritage. But in India, da Gama's legacy is viewed very differently. In Calicut, where he first landed, there are no monuments honoring him. The violence he inflicted is remembered, even if the specific details have faded with time. This dual legacy, hero to some, villain to others, reflects the complex nature of the age of exploration itself. It was a time of remarkable human achievement in navigation, geography, and maritime technology. It was also a time of conquest, exploitation, and cultural destruction. Both aspects are true, and both need to be acknowledged. The ships themselves, those wooden vessels that carried Diaz and da Gama around Africa and across oceans, are long gone, rotted away, wrecked in storms, or broken up when they were no longer seaworthy. But replicas have been built, allowing modern visitors to get some sense of what those voyages were like. Standing on the deck of a replica caravel, seeing how small it is, how exposed to the elements, imagining months at sea in such a vessel with only stars for guidance and salted meat for food, one can begin to appreciate the physical courage required. The podros that Diaz erected along the African coast have mostly disappeared, weathered away by centuries of wind and rain, or destroyed, or lost as coastlines changed. But a few survive or have been reconstructed, standing as lonely monuments to those early explorations. They mark not just geographical waypoints but moments when the known world expanded, when human beings pushed past their fear of the unknown and sailed into waters no one from their culture had navigated before. In the end, perhaps the most important legacy of the Diaz and da Gama voyages is the simple fact that they demonstrated what was possible. For nearly a century, Portuguese navigators had been slowly working their way down the African coast, making incremental progress, sometimes just a few miles per expedition. It must have seemed to many that the project was futile, that Africa extended forever southward, that India would never be reached by sea. But Diaz proved that Africa did have a southern end. And da Gama proved that the route to India was not just theoretically possible but practically achievable. Their success inspired other voyages, other explorations. Within a few decades of da Gama's return, Europeans had circumnavigated the globe, had mapped most of the world's major coastlines, had established the basic outlines of the modern world map. This knowledge, that the Earth was round, that the oceans connected, that no place was unreachable given enough ships and determination, fundamentally changed human consciousness. The medieval worldview, with its sharp boundaries between the known and the unknown, gave way to a modern understanding that the world, for all its diversity and vastness, was ultimately one interconnected system. For better and for worse, for good and for ill, the voyages of Bartholomew Diaz and Vasco da Gama helped create the globalized world we live in today, a world where goods, people, and ideas flow between continents, where no culture remains isolated, where actions in one place can have immediate consequences halfway around the world. They sailed into the unknown and returned with knowledge that changed everything. And so we remember them, not uncritically, not without acknowledging the suffering their voyages set in motion, but as human beings who accomplished something extraordinary. They sailed wooden ships across vast oceans guided by stars and currents and their own courage. They survived storms and scurvy and months of uncertainty. They mapped coasts and currents, adding to the store of human knowledge. They were navigators of exceptional skill, operating at the very edge of what was technically possible in their era. Rest now, in the knowledge that human beings have always been explorers, have always pushed boundaries, have always sought to know what lies beyond the horizon. The specific technologies change. Wooden ships give way to steamships, give way to aircraft, give way to spacecraft. But the fundamental human impulse to explore, to discover, to connect the unknown to the known, remains constant across the centuries. The sea that claimed Bartholomew Diaz, the ocean that tested Vasco da Gama so severely, still rolls on as it always has. Ships still round the Cape of Good Hope, though now guided by GPS rather than by stars, powered by engines rather than wind. The routes those brave and flawed men pioneered are still traveled, still connecting continents, still carrying the commerce and the ideas that bind the modern world together. And somewhere, deep beneath the waves near the Cape of Good Hope, the wreck of Bartholomew Diaz's ship lies on the ocean floor, silent, forgotten, slowly dissolving back into the sea. But the route he discovered, the knowledge he gained, the courage he demonstrated, those things remain. They are part of the foundation upon which the modern world was built, for better and for worse, for good and for ill. Sleep now, as those sailors slept after their long voyages, as the world turned beneath them, as the stars wheeled overhead, as the patient ocean kept its secrets and surrendered them only slowly, reluctantly, to those brave or stubborn or curious enough to venture out onto its vast expanse and ask, what lies beyond? What can we learn? How far can we go? The answer, we now know, is far indeed. As far as courage and knowledge and determination can carry us. As far as the horizon, and then beyond it, and then beyond that. Always farther. Always seeking. Always exploring the world we live in, this beautiful, terrible, endlessly fascinating world that those Portuguese navigators helped to map, to connect, to make knowable. Rest well, dreamer. The journey is complete. The story is told. The world awaits your own explorations, whatever form they may take. Sleep, and dream of distant shores, of patient courage, of the endless human quest to understand this world we share.